I just want to welcome everybody to Expert Talks Online. Today, we're going to be talking about scaling application security to 100 plus teams at HMRC Digital. Today, we have Ben and Gerald, who are our speakers. Ben is the head of product for HMRC's MDTP and profession for DevOps. He's worked at HMRC for 6 years on the multi-channel digital tax platform, MDTP, a service that now hosts over 1,000 microservices. Working across the different teams who develop the platform itself, trying to ensure that HMRC is always able to meet the needs of their direct customers. And then our other speaker is Gerald, who is a software engineering career that spanned over 25 years in public, financial, and telecom sectors. He's consulting with equal experts and is currently leading the AppSec program at HMRC Digital. He's previously been an architect and the technical lead at delivery flagship of HMRC programs. He's also previously worked with Money Supermarket, Barclays, and MBNA as a software architect, tech lead, and senior developer. His primary interests are around middle tier services, databases, security, automation, and functional programming. In this talk, Ben and Gerald are going to go through how HMRC Digital takes proactive steps to ensure that we're protected from known vulnerabilities and also that they're in a position to react quickly and confidently as incidents occur. So I'm going to hand over to Ben and Gerald now, and please use the Q&A box for any questions. You can vote for ones you want answered sooner, and I will read them off at the end. Thanks, everybody. So Gerald and Ben.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everybody who's given up a bit of lunchtime to come and listen to this. And yeah, welcome to this talk about application security. As Julia said, my name's Ben Conrad. I'm a civil servant at HMRC, currently spending as much time as I can pacing around the office, trying to rack up the steps in the Equal Experts Walkathon, and taking a break to talk about how some of the steps that we take to secure the services that we host at HMRC. As many of you already know, HMRC, the UK Tax Authority, we are responsible for those ominous brown envelopes that you get through your door.
And I'm an AppSec snooper. Ben has brought me along to the platform to turn over stones, pull on strings, and hopefully, ultimately, make myself redundant.
You may at this point be thinking that this talk is going to be incredibly niche, and in some ways it is, but we're intending to broaden it out to cover things that you can use elsewhere. In this talk, we really want to deliver a few clear points that will be useful for anyone interested in improving the security of web applications.
You told me that you really wanted to focus on the takeaways for this talk, and here they are.
So we'll be talking about taking responsibility for security, on how there's nobody out there that's going to magically fix this for you. We'll also talk about how scale can make this appear unmanageable, but actually there are methods that make it easier, and that it doesn't make sense to try and do this on your own in isolation.
So now that we've presented our conclusion, thanks for coming to the talk. I hope you...
Wait a minute. I think we need to give a bit more information than that.
All right.
So there's not going to be a lot of this, but we'll start out with a little bit of context. In an effort to reduce their postage costs and save on the brown envelopes, HMRC has been building digital services in line with the approach defined by the UK Government Digital Service, which is broadly digital by default. To make this easier, HMRC has this multi-channel digital tax platform, MDTP, or just the tax platform, or indeed just the platform. The platform exists to make building and hosting digital services as easy as possible. It is a platform as a service where the infrastructure, logging, metrics, alerting, CI/CD, testing, prototyping, templates, everything you need to build and develop a digital service is provided out of the box. And importantly, with very few exceptions, it is entirely self-service. We talk about MDTP having opinions. The opinions we hold define the paved road, the golden path, the bowling alley of success that we provide to our users, with the intention that following that paved road will allow the teams to build services quickly and efficiently. The intention is that developers working on the platform can focus on solving business problems and deliver value really quickly.
And one of those guardrails is security, specifically AppSec.
AppSec. For someone with a mild speech impediment, there is a risk it will sound much more rude than it normally is. Application security, which we differentiate from our platform security team. The teams who build the platform have always taken responsibility for the security of the platform itself, the infrastructures, the features that we build. The platform can be hardened and held to be relatively secure, but that doesn't really count for a lot if the applications we're hosting on it are riddled with vulnerabilities that are easy to exploit. We may be able to build very strong walls that can withstand all sorts of attacks, but if the windows and doors are wide open, it's not going to provide a high level of protection. Responsibility for the security of any given service will always remain with the team that owns it. But we think we can help. We can provide tooling that enables teams to proactively check for known vulnerabilities in their own code as part of an automated CI/CD pipeline.
It's important to remember that security isn't a goal in its own right. It's something that needs to be looked at in context. It's no good just throwing lots of security tooling at a problem and then giving yourself a pat on the back and a tick in the box.
So we wanted to know if we could do more. And a couple of years ago, we started some investigations looking at the security of the applications that we're hosting. We examined the patterns used by the service teams to deliver those services, and we looked at the way that those patterns were being implemented.
That's why I called myself an AppSec snooper.
So Gerald, why is application security a hard problem?
Where to start? We've written down some examples on this slide, but each of those bullet points could probably be a talk in itself.
We do not have that long. What's the problem with the supply chain?
Well, what isn't the problem with the supply chain? As a platform, we've got around 1,000 tenant microservices. Even though we've got this paved road and strongly recommended technology choices, we still end up with thousands of dependencies on open source libraries. And every week, there are new reports of vulnerabilities. The traditional view of supply chain security is patch, patch, patch.
That does sound like a lot of effort, and I'm really lazy.
It is a lot of effort. Considering that most of the vulnerabilities can't actually be exploited, it might sound a little cavalier, but all too often, vulnerabilities can only be exploited in a specific edge case, and a lot of the time, we don't use it that way.
So you're saying that constant patching may be unnecessary?
That's right.
Great. What's next on our list?
Martin Lewis, the bane of websites all over the UK.
So the problem here isn't really Martin Lewis per se. It's that he goes on television and instructs millions of viewers to log into a specific website, sometimes my websites, all at the same time, resulting in an unintentional denial of service attack.
It's my very last reason for keeping up to date with the TV schedule. When Martin is on and mentions you, traffic skyrockets. But it's not the only non-malicious denial of service. Sometimes you can have bugs that cause infinite redirects where you denial of service yourself. What else keeps us busy?
Well, you keep finding leaks in our logs. We do try to keep personally identifiable information out of our logs. Couldn't we just redact it all?
Redaction, I think, hardly ever works properly. Either we would miss a lot, or we would redact just everything. It's also easy to sort of have a false sense of security by using redaction. Ultimately, whether you redact or not, you're still going to have to check your logs.
We have a lot of logs, billions a day, and it's important that engineers and developers can query them all when troubleshooting. At the same time, we have a legal duty to ensure we protect any PII data.
And lost PII could lead to lots of fraud.
Those same logs and audit events are deliberately collected and used by fraud investigation teams. So is fraud an AppSec problem?
I think it depends. If a fraudster is able to submit lots of requests on behalf of other people and we're not guarding against that, I think it is.
I think this is an important point. The most fraud happens not by hacking a website, but usually using that website as intended, just with false data. If you want to lie to HMRC, you can do so using a phone or a letter just as well as a website. Let's skip over the last two. Needless to say, there are always issues around processing data supplied by a third party. So security is a challenge. It's our challenge. So far as I know, and I think I would have heard, there is no secret UK cyber force that is going to come in and make your services secure. You have to do it yourself.
And I also would be careful about thinking that we can just throw money at the problem.
There are lots and lots of vendors that want to sell me tools, and some of them do look pretty useful.
I think tools are good, but it still requires a lot of work to integrate them. And I happen to think that some of the tooling is a little bit counterproductive. A lot of tooling uses the idea of scores. Whenever a vulnerability is found, it's given a score on how bad it is. The score ranges from 0 to 10, from low to critical. Yet we've encountered vulnerabilities in our libraries with a score of a critical 10, and then upon closer inspection found that it just wasn't exploitable. But the problem is also that the reverse is true. We found that it was possible to kill a server with a single request, but the highest score that the scoring system would allow was 7.5.
So you're just saying you can't rely on those scores?
Nope. If we set an arbitrary threshold, like anything is fine under 8 and everything must be fixed over 8, then we would miss bad vulnerabilities and spend a lot of time fixing others that are not even exploitable.
So on the platform, we've got a tool called JFrog X-Ray, and we're just going to talk a little bit about that one tool. All of our services publish their artifacts into Artifactory, and X-Ray scans all the dependencies and then compares them against a database of known vulnerabilities. And we get a list.
Yes, a long list. When we first created an X-Ray report for all our artifacts, it broke the reporting. As the list contained over 500,000 reports, the reporting just crashed. And as we discussed previously, we couldn't exactly ignore any reports based on the score. Also, the user interface for X-Ray was a bit rubbish. I'm sorry to do this. I don't like calling out vendors in public, but it just wasn't possible to get any kind of idea of what vulnerabilities were causing a problem. Nobody's going to trawl through thousands and thousands of reports, and a lot of them are duplicate because so many of our services were using the same libraries and we had so many versions of the same service.
So the list was useless?
Well, no. On the contrary, the information in the reports was really useful. But in order for us to use it, we had to make it work for us. So we prototyped a really simplistic data pipeline that would pull out only the versions of services that we actually had deployed, used some scripting to aggregate the information, turned that into CSVs, and then we used spreadsheets to create pretty charts.
Prior to this, we didn't know how many services had vulnerable libraries, and X-Ray provided us with some really, really good intelligence. The fact that the tax platform has got this paved road and the guardrails that we've talked about meant that the AppSec team could centralize the analysis of the vulnerabilities, which meant it wasn't necessary for every team to analyze the same information, the same dependencies over and over again. And this is what the outcome of that vulnerability analysis looks like.
The important thing to note is that there is a curation status column. The AppSec team look at every vulnerability and do a preliminary assessment. This saves the service teams from having to do this and gives us and them a view of what needs to be done first.
The data allows us to look across all of the services. I don't want to get involved in how each of our 100 teams is implementing the services. And we have to be pragmatic that not everyone is going to be able to fix everything immediately. The truth is that we have an awful lot of services and each of them will have a backlog of things that have to be delivered for them. But I find it really, really useful to have this high level view to see the trends, to see whether things are getting better or worse. The last two slides showed information from what we call the catalog. The catalog allows us to surface information about the 1,000 microservices and the 4,000 repositories that make up the platform. It's a window into the build status, dependencies, runtime information for each and every service and team.
Just to add, this isn't manually maintained information. The catalog uses GitHub users and teams and configuration and metrics. Making it manageable also applies to security. We employ lots of different defenses in order to make it easy to prevent security problems. We try to do this at the platform level so that problems don't have to be solved by each individual team over and over again. And at our scale, that means automation. It might be easy to keep 10 microservices in your head, but when it comes to over 1,000, you need help.
So this slide has some big numbers on it, and the chart is a view into the tenant services. The point is that we are operating at significant scale and quite a lot of changes to code. The big drop that you can see there is Christmas. Cheers.
Yeah, and each of those commits could be built into a new artifact, and those will then need to be tested. It really does create a challenge for HMRC. Things are constantly changing on the platform, and we want to know that we're not introducing security holes with those changes.
Just to be clear, the number of changes is not in itself a security problem. Indeed, very much the opposite. If we implemented a change freeze, which there are some people in HMRC who are very keen to do, and set the whole platform in AppSec for the next year, we would become far more vulnerable to security incidents, not less. A portion of these deployments will be to upgrade code to remove older versions with known security risks, but all of these changes will be improvements to services that HMRC makes available, and the higher numbers are better.
This leads us back to the tooling we've developed. One of my favorite tools is the Dependency Explorer. This allows us to search through all dependencies of all the services.
And the screenshot here is why Log4Shell vulnerability at Christmas 2021 was really, really scary for only about 10 minutes.
Yes, we searched for the vulnerable library and nobody was using it in production. I have to add that we've had this functionality for over 4 years now, way before S-bombs, and it's really such a valuable tool.
We should probably add that we still spent quite a lot of time investigating other ways in which this vulnerable library could be used in other places on the platform. That some of our platform security measures were also really useful defenses. So we have a WAF in place and we have egress protection, which really would have limited the impact of Log4Shell anyway.
That's right. It's a really important point. Never rely on just a single defense. This is kind of related to the application security approach that we're taking. In some ways, there are lots of manual interventions. We mentioned that for the vulnerability curation, we started with a spreadsheet and then iterated from there. The same approach is used in most of our tooling. We have an idea, we try it out manually, we automate it a bit, and then we scale it. But importantly, we only do that when we see value at each step.
So this is how we arrived at some of our other tools. We have a leak detection tool that alerts us when something sensitive is added to GitHub. And we have a tool that we call Bobby, after the policeman, which blocks builds if there's an unwanted dependency.
That's right. I think this lightweight approach is really important in security. You could even say it's agile security.
Agile security leads us onto the fact that security, like software development, is a team sport. A central application security team would never have the capacity to know all domains of all the services.
So we talk to our tenants.
We're also working really closely with the platform security team to ensure that the infrastructure protections and the application security align. And there's also HMRC security that get all the infrastructure events and monitor in the Security Operations Center. They also set the policies that we have to follow. I think this is a really crux of the matter is we've talked about how our application security team can curate a lot of this information. But in terms of actually writing the code to deliver a fix, that is always going to be down to our users to do that. And it's all about ensuring that nobody works in a silo. So our application security team is an enabling team.
Yes. So our first attempt at this slide looked quite different. We had like a hub and a spoke and an AppSec at the center, but that sent out the wrong message. Service teams are not at the edge when it comes to security. Security is all about context. The AppSec team cannot work without the knowledge of the service teams, but similarly, the service teams can't do everything themselves. That would cause just a lot of duplication and confusion.
And that's where the opinionated approach comes in really handy. It paves the way for having an AppSec team. If there were 15 ways of building a service in 5 different languages with 10 different frameworks, it just would be impossible to provide that curation and provide that guidance. So here we are. This was a brief overview of making application security better. We looked at how we started small and took that responsibility.
We've identified that there are massive challenges about doing this at scale, and we had to find ways to make it manageable.
And most importantly, security is pulling together lots of different people and making sure they're all pulling in the same direction. A lot of what we've done is only possible because we don't allow every latest shiny technology on our platform. And we actively go out of our way to ensure that people are building services on it are aligned to that approach. This doesn't just mean in terms of technology choices, but also in how we work and how we think that digital services should be delivered. And while we're flexible enough to bend those rules, indeed, if something is shown to be valuable, I hope that we would adopt it quickly. We've learned that having this this golden path is really useful. So we wanted to leave you with a picture of the paved road. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much. I've got a first question here. How expensive was it?
I don't know if I'm allowed to answer that. So
dance around it.
I would find it quite difficult to kind of give you a pounds and pence answer. I think my take on it would be that it's cheaper to do this and have this centralized team who are able to do the investigations than it would be to try and get every single team to do it on their own. And that really is the alternative. And that's kind of where we started. So every single service on the platform before it goes live needs to have some security testing by an authorized third party. That's really inexpensive in its own. And the results of those tests are often repetitious, to say the least. You can get the impression that somebody's just copying and pasting from the last report, but it's because of that the fact that we've got that consistency of technology and patterns. Gerald, do you want to?
I think it's also important to sort of think that it's actually really easy to start small. You don't necessarily need to build lots of different bespoke tooling to start off with. It's that sort of idea of sort of starting with some manual steps and saying, okay, well, I'm bored of doing that manually every day. So what can I do to make it easier? And sometimes the best tool I found in securing systems is just to create lists and spreadsheets of things that can really help you, give you an overview. So I don't think it needs to cost all that much money, but it is important to sort of have a think of what the trade-offs are between like having complete flexibility and lots of languages to have teams to do what they want, to actually being able to provide some enabling teams to sort of give help with security.
The next question kind of leads on to this. If you were starting to build the AppSec platform and capabilities and tooling again, would you change your approach?
Possibly. If we were starting absolutely from scratch, then I think we'd have a different environment anyway. I'm not sure that we would have chosen exactly the technologies that we're using on the platform, which isn't to say that they've been bad choices, but just, I think there are alternatives that you'd certainly want to look at now. Making the absolute right choice isn't important. It's the fact that we made a choice and stuck to it, which is where the payoff comes from. I think we probably have been, if not trailblazers, then early adopters of a lot of this. And in some ways, you can probably buy off the shelf some of the tooling that we've written in-house, but written in-house years ago and iterated on. So starting from scratch, we probably would go and see what the market has to offer.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question from Nick Silver. He asked, thank you. What are the challenges in getting time from application developers to work on your security issues? And how did you solve those problems?
If I could, it's persistent nagging is essentially what I like to think of it. I mean, before I sort of went into AppSec, I've been a software developer, so I can completely understand the problems that teams have with ensuring that security is there. I think the really important thing is to make sure that there's a culture of security isn't just hidden away in some ivory tower that comes down at the very last moment and slams a gate in front of you just before you were sort of trying to deploy. Security specialists need to work with the teams, which means that they need to be able to dive in and understand what their code is doing, need to be able to be open to say, oh, we've got this particular issue, how can we fix it? And need to be able to say, oh, we can see this isn't ideal, and maybe you can fix it in future, but for now we'll be pragmatic and take a risk-driven approach to say, well, the risk of somebody doing this is actually really bad, so you don't need to drop everything and fix it straight away. It's being sort of a little bit realistic that then gives that relationship where development teams can kind of come in and say, well, okay, we would trust security to sort of point us to the right thing, but they're not unreasonable and just have a set of rules that must be followed at every step and at every stage. And I think that's really important when starting out, because if you start out as a sort of idea of us versus them, securities versus developers, then people just find ways around you or ignore you, or and I think
if I could just expand on that a little bit, Gerald, I think it's not just security versus developers on MDTP where we work. I think it's also a general culture that this is a collaborative effort. I think there is some nagging, and there is some I have an HMRC badge which gives me a degree of authority to go and tell people what to do. But I don't think it is based on those badges. I don't think it is, kind of client and supplier. I think it is more, we understand that people have got a backlog of things to deliver. We're not generally asking for these things to be done yesterday, unless, there is an ongoing issue that really is being actively exploited. And so you have to be pragmatic on both sides.
Makes sense. Okay, the next question is, some CVEs are only an issue within certain parameters. Think Spring for Shell. Wouldn't you still have to approach the respective teams to figure out whether or not those parameters are given?
Yes. Basically, I think that's where the real benefit of having the paved road comes in, because we know that all of our services are built in a certain way, because we want teams to focus on solving the business issues rather than solving technology issues. It makes it easy to sort of find outliers, if you like. If somebody were to go and say, right, I'm not using this language, I'm using a different language, and I'm trying to solve something in a different way, it would stand out like a sore thumb. And we'd be able to talk to them to say, you know, what are you trying to achieve? And the reasons why we try to have these guardrails is because it allows us to sort of manage this in a much better way. But yeah, ultimately, if there is something that would indicate that somebody uses an affected version, the AppSec team, as part of the curation, would do a preliminary dig in to see, you know, oh, how is this used? And if we can't make head or tail of it, the first thing would be to go and talk to the team itself and say, look, there is this issue. Could it affect us? And then we would collaboratively work out whether there's something to be done. And that's sort of the whole point of having this curation approach. Curation doesn't mean that AppSec will take all the CVEs away and fix everything for you or work out everything for you, but it can do a lot, which means that not every team has to do it themselves, and that's where the value comes in from adding a dedicated sort of AppSec resource.
We have just 3 more questions and I believe 10 more minutes. So the next question is, you mentioned the danger of over-relying on vendor-provided tools. Did you have to fight any interior with stakeholders mandating tools that were already purchased at HMRC?
Yes. That's my job. I think if you have somebody who's prepared to have those fights, and as I say, I sort of think that's what HMRC pay me to do, rather ironically, then you're in a good place. We often like to say that MDTP is a purely owned and operated HMRC thing, and then there are other times where we're being asked to adopt
Looks like Ben is
tooling is massively separate. Oh, I'm sorry.
Must be the secret HMRC.
I was about to be rude about my colleagues.
Yes, yes.
The answer is yes, we do have to.
Okay, the next, I was just told we can actually go till 1 o'clock. So if other people have more questions.
Nobody asked me. No.
Please don't, please, we've captured you now. So if you do have any more questions, don't feel like you can't ask them. The next one is from Thomas. What do you think what are the lessons learned that the wider HMRC or government in general could benefit from?
I would be slightly hesitant to read too much into this. We've adopted this method because of where we are. And I think if we were in a different place, then we would have done something different. I'm hesitant to say that, you know, everybody in government should adopt what we're doing, because I don't think that it is the only way of successfully delivering digital services. That said, I think that we are showing that there is a real benefit to having a consistent way of hosting, building, maintaining these services. And there are other really large benefits as well. And it's once you've achieved that, and once you've got that consistency, I think you'd be slightly crazy to move away from it, because I think it is like what a lot of people are trying to achieve.
Yeah. How do you assess vulnerabilities to ascertain whether to resolve them or live with them?
Well, there's a number of steps involved, and usually it's sort of trying to discount it as early as possible. So the first step is simply reading the description, and if the description tells me, oh, this is used in a way that I can discount because we're not using it, then it stops there. Often the descriptions are incredibly vague because the maintainers don't want to give away how something gets exploited. So it then becomes a bit of detective work. And it is, you know, I'm not going to lie, looking at all the CVs and curating them is hard work, because sometimes you have to go and dig into the source code of the patch that was published, or try to find exploits elsewhere. Sometimes you have to give up and say, I can't make head or tail of it. I don't understand how this is being exploited. The safest thing is to try and advise teams to upgrade, and that's what we sometimes do. But I think by just having this approach of doing that, there's so many CVEs where I can read the description and can say, oh, well, we're not using it that way. We don't have to worry about this one. Because of the paved road and because of the patterns that we've got. Now, because we've got the tooling that allows us to identify which CVs are new and which ones have not yet been curated and which ones do I have to have a look at. After the initial investment, where we sort of spent quite some time looking at, I think we had about 500, 600 CVEs that were potentially impacting, and we worked through them all, and then we went, right, we're now in a position where it actually gets easier to keep on top of it, if that makes sense and helps.
Got questions from Jerome. How can you rely on a third-party cloud providers? Do we need to distribute the workloads?
I think this is possibly my favorite question. I'm not sure it's directly related to this talk, but let me try and answer it anyway. How can we rely on a third-party cloud provider? They are so much more reliable than the alternative of trying to run your own hardware that I think it's the only way of ensuring that something is resilient and robust. In terms of should we distribute our workloads, yes, absolutely. On the MDTP platform level, we do that by making use of multiple availability zones. We do have to maintain all of the data that we hold, which isn't actually a lot, within the geographical borders of the UK. So we're slightly limited in the level of resilience that we can adopt there. HMRC is very keen not to put every workload into the same cloud provider. And they do, I think, more for commercial reasons than technical ones, make sure that there is a balance of cloud providers being used. In terms of resilience, I think that's actually possibly counterproductive, because it means that if you have an outage at a single cloud provider, then you're pretty much guaranteed that some part of HMRC is going to be hit by it. But that's a different issue.
One last one from Jerome as well. How do you shift left security at design, as most of the time it's reactive, as penetration testing of the cloud app happens after development and prod?
Oh, this is my favorite question. Can we have Jerome again? This is really good. I think the crucial bit here is to not just be the gate at the end when the pen tester come in. Security can't start with the pen test. Security has to start at being involved. And to a certain extent, this is all about creating a culture where going and talking to security or asking a question doesn't mean that you come away battered and have to now implement lots of things that you never planned on doing. I think if security can be, aware as to what's going on and create that sort of atmosphere where, oh, I have a question on security and I can just go and ask the security team and they will help me, rather than, oh, I now have got to talk to security and they will find all these issues and will batter me, then I think that's half the battle. Now, I think this does mean that essentially it is really important to sort of keep your ears open, keep your ears to the ground and sort of see what's going on. Because a lot of the time you sort of find things that are hidden in innocent question when somebody says, oh, I'd like to do this. And sometimes it's sort of just really worth sort of going, yes, but why would you like to do this? And how would you like to do that? And have you considered this? And we could help you with doing that. And again, it might sound like a broken record, but the paved road helps there, because if you have lots of patterns that are sort of the best practice, you can be across them and say, okay, well, we make sure that this is done in a secure way. So if you follow the paved road, you're less likely to sort of fall down some ditch that is insecure, if you excuse my murdering the metaphors. Does that make sense?
I think I'd just like to mention that the policy of HMRC is certainly that any pen testing ought to take place before a service is launched, public at least. So the environment it happens in is technicality, but it doesn't have to wait until that point that it's launched.
We have another question from Peter. How do you use approved patterns in automated governance for security and operational speed agility of delivery?
So I think that this is the raison d'etre of MDTP. It's if you're managing to set those patterns and automate that governance, then you facilitate the speed and agility of delivery. So what that means in practice is things like we will set up the CI/CD pipelines. We make everything as self-service as possible, but it's self-service with a Jenkins job or a GitHub PR, and it's going to be reviewed by somebody else, in the case of GitHub anyway. And the way in which a change in GitHub will trigger a build, which will then be scanned, which will then be deployed into one of our pre-production environments. It will then have a suite of automated tests run against it, potentially including static code analysis, Zap, Dash tools. All of those things give you a high degree of confidence that you couldn't get at that sort of speed without that automation, that your build is good and that deploying it is going to be successful. And it's that automation of the governance as well that really enables the teams building services on MDTP to do so in an agile way.
And I'd just like to add, we don't have you don't have to go to an AppSec committee and submit a request in writing to use a particular open source library. If you want to use an open source library, then you can use an open source library. But AppSec we have the tooling with the dependency explorer that we mentioned in the talk, and the Bobby rules to sort of A, look at what dependencies are being used, and B, to say, well, we don't want you to use this, we're going to block it. Often blocking isn't a one day it's there, the next day it's not. It's more often is a way of saying, okay, well, we are going to deprecate this in so many months. There's lots of communication, warnings, and making sure that people aren't using something that they shouldn't really be using. But it is having that tooling in place, that observability that allows us to find what different patterns are being used. And like I said before in the talk, there's thousands of open source libraries. There's not one way of parsing XML. There's different ways that are being used. We just like to point people to a particular one and say, okay, this is what what a safe one looks like, if that makes sense. So we have all the guardrails, but we don't trade that off by saying you have to seek approval for every single thing that you might want to do, because that would choke off productivity.
Yeah. Another question: as most of the applications are getting containerized, how do we ensure security of the container images, as these are picked from the registries and the attacks on the pipeline?
Well, for one thing is we don't actually use container images that are based on just any old image. We do have base images, and the actual services are built in such a way that they always use the same base image. So you can't just go off and say, oh, I'll pick this Docker base image that I've seen on the internet somewhere that will give me all of this. This is sort of part of those guardrails, the paved roads, that we ensure that things are built a certain way before you can deploy them. So this is where things are a bit restrictive, but allow us the ability to keep things in check and keep running platforms securely with quite a lot of teams, quite a lot of services, whilst not having a massive amount of engineers to look after everything, if that makes sense.
I also wouldn't want anybody to come away from this talk with the feeling that we're arrogant enough to think that we have solved security and the web applications are now done. We are trying to showcase some of the things that we're doing in order to make it harder for anybody who's trying to attack a service that we're hosting. That doesn't mean that we are infallible, because I am quite sure we're not.
I found my share of clangers, but I think the important thing is that we found them rather than somebody else, or the BBC News tells us that somebody has found a clanger.
Great. I think we're out of questions now. I want to thank Ben and Gerald for doing this. This has been great. And yeah, I guess if anyone has any more questions, can contact Gerald or Ben or even myself. I'm at Equal Experts. Yeah, and that was our expert talk online. Yeah, if you're interested in joining EE, please follow the link on the screen there. Thank you, everybody.